Hey, it's Mrs. Gregg. Let's talk about terrestrial pollution. Know that humans are the only organisms that are going to generate solid waste. The biggest producer of solid waste, as far as the United States, is going to be the mining, oil, and gas industry. If you look at the municipal here, that is the type of waste, it's municipal solid waste that comes from homes and businesses. That's a small portion of the entire waste stream. And know that we have, since World War II, become a throwaway society. Prior to World War II, we tended to recycle and reuse items. Now we just throw them away. And part of that has to do with what we call planned obsolescence, the idea that certain manufactured items are intended to only last for a short period of time. So think cell phones, computers, TVs, those become obsolete pretty quickly. And manufacturers do that so that you buy another one, but that creates a problem then as far as what to do with all the waste. The biggest single component of the municipal waste stream is going to be paper. And there's a special case with electronic waste of how to dispose of it, because electronic waste has metals in it. Now there's silver and gold that can be recovered for one. There are also heavy metals such as mercury, lead, cadmium that are toxic if they were to leak into the groundwater, if they were thrown away in a regular landfill, and then you've got groundwater issues with those things leaking into the groundwater. So consequently what we do is we ship our electronic waste, and most industrialized nations do, we ship our electronic waste off to Asia, where there are less strict requirements about how that electronic waste is handled. And so there are just open dump sites where they put electronic waste, and they aren't as concerned about their groundwater as we are. Also, there are people who have like home businesses with recycling that electronic waste, and there you have issues of being exposed to toxic metals in your home. We are probably all familiar with the 3 R's, with reduce, reuse, recycle. As far as reducing, that is going to be the first choice, the most important thing that we can do as far as reducing the amount of solid waste overall, if we just reduce how much we use. So if we consume less, and then in terms of the manufacturing process, if we use less in manufacturing or do things like reduce the amount of packaging, then overall that's going to help with reducing the amount of waste that we have to deal with. Next thing is that you can reuse a product. That means reuse it exactly as it was intended. You're not changing the form. So like say you have a recyclable or a reusable grocery bag that you take to the grocery store all the time. That's an example of reusing something. There, ideally you shouldn't be using any energy in order to reuse that, unless maybe you are passing it on to another person and there might be some energy required in order to clean up that object, prepare it, or transport it to someone else as far as reusing. Last thing you can do is recycle it. So there you're going to take the product, recycle it so that you can use it again, so that we aren't having to use raw materials in order to produce new products. The problem with that is that it's energy intensive and it's costly. There are 2 types of recycling you need to know about. There's closed loop recycling, where you take the object and you are recycling it into the same type of object. So carpet is an example. You can take carpet fibers, recycle them to make new carpet fibers. That's closed loop recycling. Next one is open loop recycling. With open loop recycling, you are taking a product and you are recycling it into something totally different. So an example would be like water bottles. Those plastic water bottles can be recycled to make fibers, which then can be turned into cloth like you can make jackets out of. So that's open loop recycling. In the United States, about 30% of our municipal waste stream can be recycled or composted. So that's important, or composted, excuse me. As far as recycling, the problem there is that a lot of times it is more expensive to recycle an object than it is just to make a brand new one with original raw materials. So like glass and plastic, it's actually cheaper to make them as a single-use thing than it is to take glass and plastic and to recycle it into new objects. And then looking at recycling and how we recycle, there's single stream recycling and there's multi-stream recycling. With multi-stream, you have to sort it before you throw it into the recycling bin. So we are probably most familiar with single stream. There it all goes into one big bin and you send it to a single stream recycling facility where they sort it. Some of it is mechanical, where they have machines that take care of that, and then part of that is humans. People are actually sorting through that and sorting into plastics, paper, metal, and glass so that it can be recycled. One thing to note, those plastic sacks that you get at the grocery store, you don't ever want to put those into recycling because they actually float pretty easily and they will clog up the machines. They'll get in the gears and they'll tear up the machines. So you don't want to recycle those plastic bags unless it's going to a special place that can handle that. Talking about compost, one of the things that we have moved towards since, I don't know, past 20, 30 years is composting more, in part because, if you put organic waste into a landfill, it generates methane. So organic materials, as they're breaking down aerobically exposed to the air, they're going to break down to essentially carbon dioxide and water. But whenever organic materials decompose anaerobically, which is what happens in a landfill, you send stuff to the landfill, it gets covered over. As it decomposes anaerobically, instead it makes carbon dioxide and methane. And methane is a really potent greenhouse gas. It's like 28 times more potent than carbon dioxide is. So we need to find a way to collect that methane for one, or we can just avoid sending the organic matter into the landfill and causing that problem in the first place. So composting is one way to avoid that. You can take anything that's green like yard waste, vegetables, paper, and those types of things, you can compost them and you end up making essentially what's fertilizer. So here's what we start with, and you give it a while, give it a couple of months, and you end up with broken down materials that you can use like fertilizer. The bad thing is that you can have odor and it can draw rodents, attract rodents. There are municipal composting facilities. We have one in Cobb County off of the County Farm Road, but it doesn't take like food waste and that type of thing. It takes like yard waste, and they'll compost it, and you can go and actually get that compost and put it in your yard if you want. And then on to municipal solid waste. So about half of what we have as far as municipal solid waste is going to go into a landfill. The problem with landfills is that as they sit there for a while and as you have rain that falls on them, then we can end up with nasty toxic chemicals leaching into the groundwater. Another problem is as any kind of organic matter that's in the landfill is decomposing anaerobically, then we can end up with things like methane and some other toxic gases that are released into the atmosphere. There are two types of landfills. One is an open dump, and the United States outlawed those many years ago. But an open dump is just like an open pit or a field where you dump the trash. And the problem with that is there's nothing to prevent what's in the garbage from seeping into the groundwater. Okay, now everything in the United States is what we call a sanitary landfill, where it's lined to prevent stuff from leaking into the groundwater, and it's designed to be as clean as possible. Here's an example of a modern landfill. So there's a liner and there's clay. Remember, clay is very impermeable, so that adds, but a lot of times there's like a physical liner too, and then clay. And then they put in the garbage, and they'll come by every day sometimes. They'll compact the garbage, and then a lot of times add a layer of clay on top daily to help reduce the smell coming off and help keep animals from being attracted to it. And they'll do that for a while. They keep adding garbage and keep layering on clay until it fills up. And then over here on this part, it talks about the methane extraction system. So you can collect that methane that is produced as any organics that are in that garbage as they decompose anaerobically, and you can use that methane for other things like generating electricity. Some terms that you need to know: leachate is going to be the water that can leak through and pick up the nasty stuff that's in the municipal solid waste, and it can leak into the groundwater. So they want to have ways to collect that leachate so that it's not percolating down into the groundwater. Another thing you need to be familiar with is tipping fees. So every time they go and collect trash in your neighborhood and then they head off to the landfill and they dump it, they're having to pay a fee for each truckload. And the approximate fee right now is $50 per ton. One thing to note about tipping fees is if tipping fees become too expensive, then what does that do? That discourages people from dumping trash in the landfill, and then they'll go and they'll dump it illegally. So tipping fees, you have to have kind of a happy medium there. You have to have enough of a tipping fee that you can make the landfill work economically, but if you make it too expensive, that discourages people from using the landfill, and then we end up with problems with illegally dumped waste. One of the problems with landfills is not in my backyard. No one wants that close to them. Once a landfill is finished, you can cap it off with a nice layer of clay and then topsoil and then plant over it, and that prevents erosion. And they're actually doing that and reclaiming it and using it in some cases for parkland. Or you can restore habitat on it and use it like a park. And then again with the landfill gas, as any organics that are in the waste are decomposing, you're ending up making methane and carbon dioxide, and it's about 50-50. So you can collect that, you can burn that methane, use it to turn a turbine, to turn a generator so that you generate electricity. As far as that landfill gas, once that landfill has been capped off, about 1 or 2 years after it's been capped off, it starts making landfill gas. You've got enough landfill gas to collect, and then this can go on for 15 to 25 years. Also, as that landfill gas, if you collect it continuously while you're adding to the landfill, it's actually going to reduce the landfill volume, and it will allow you to dispose of additional waste. There are some things that are not accepted in sanitary landfills, and there are special landfills for them. The problem is that some people find that to be inconvenient, and so consequently they will illegally dump those things. So like tires, you can't put those in regular landfill. There's special landfills for those. People don't want to go to all that trouble and a little bit more expense, and so they'll just dump them illegally. And then know that tires, this is one of the things that's in the AP curriculum, specifically talks about the tires, the fact that tires left out will collect rainwater and they can become breeding grounds for mosquitoes. There are some countries that dispose of their waste by dumping it in the ocean. The top 6 countries for ocean garbage are listed here, all of them Asian countries. And we talked in the water pollution one about the fact that there are ocean gyres, and there's that Great Pacific Garbage Patch where a lot of that garbage is collecting. So be familiar with that. You also watch the video about that. One way that you can deal with waste if you aren't using a landfill is you can incinerate it. Whenever countries or municipalities are doing that, it is to reduce the volume and the mass of the waste primarily, but you can also use that heat in order to generate electricity. The bad thing about that is you still have ash that's left over, and that ash can actually concentrate, just like we see with coal plants. The ash that's left over is concentrated as far as toxic metals and some of the nasty stuff. Here's an example of how they incinerate trash. Out in Singapore, they use waste, they burn it in order to generate electricity, and then their solution with the ash is they take it by barge out to an offshore landfill, and they are creating an artificial island, an artificial habitat actually, by doing that. Disadvantages of incinerators, again, that ash has toxic metals in it, and so you're going to have to dispose of that in a special landfill. And then also you've got the air pollution problem. Nobody wants that in their backyard either. And then if you are burning it, it tends to discourage recycling. On to hazardous waste. There are 2 classes of hazardous waste. Okay, one is any kind of organic compounds that we learned about, like pesticides, PCBs, dioxins. That's one class. The other is these toxic heavy metals. There are special hazardous waste facilities Those have to be manned by specially trained hazardous waste personnel, and there are only a few of these types of hazardous waste facilities in the United States. They aren't everywhere. Hazardous waste, things like paint, insecticides, solvents, you can't just throw those away in your garbage. Those need to be collected and disposed of. A lot of times they'll have hazardous waste collection days. We do that at Walton. And you take that and then it's disposed of at a special facility. And the reason why is so that we don't end up with this hazardous waste leaking down into our groundwater. As far as legislation, remember there are 10 laws that you're responsible for, and CERCLA, which is the Superfund Act, that's the one that regulates and pays up for the cleanup of hazardous waste sites. Also, don't forget about RCRA, which is the cradle-to-grave tracking of hazardous waste. The EPA maintains a national priorities list of sites that are eligible for cleanup under the Superfund Act, and this shows all of the sites as of last year. And it's good to know a certain case studies. So Love Canal is one. Love Canal was originally a hazardous waste landfill, and sometime in the 70s, 80s, they decided to develop it as a housing development and also a school. So they covered it over with clay, built houses on top of it. What happened was that hazardous waste it actually bubbled up in some places, and people were having serious health problems who lived next to those hazardous waste areas. So in 1983, Love Canal was declared a Superfund cleanup site, and they evacuated everybody and cleaned up the area, and as of 2003, people were allowed to move back in. They had, they had bulldozed all the houses and stuff before, but they cleaned it up and it was ready for redevelopment. However, there are some people who complain of similar problems today. That was Love Canal in the 80s. So here you can see where the hazardous waste was, and it was bubbling up in this area. And it was a very big deal in the 80s about Love Canal. Here's Love Canal in the 50s whenever it was being used to dump hazardous waste. And then here it is as of the 80s when houses were all built around it. A brownfield is an abandoned site, either commercial or industrial, that's been contaminated. So things that are brownfields could be old factories, junkyards, landfills. Gas stations can be declared as brownfields. They have to be cleaned up before they can be reused and reborn as something else. A nice example in Atlanta is Atlantic Station. Atlantic Station was a brownfield. It was the Atlantic Industrial Steel, I can't remember the name of it exactly, but there was a steel manufacturing facility on site. And as a result of the manufacturing that went on, the dirt and groundwater were contaminated with heavy metals. So it sat for a long time. I used to work across from Atlantic Station before it was Atlantic Station, and it sat for a long time just empty. Nothing was done with it. And then starting in the 90s, they cleared everything out and they started excavating all of the contaminated soil. That's why a lot of the parking in Atlantic Station is underground, because they excavated all that soil. They took it off to a special hazardous waste site, a hazardous waste dump. And then all those open holes that were left, rather than fill them in, just use it to make underground parking. But anyway, Atlantic Station is a successful example of what can be done with brownfield sites. There's a couple of ways that you need to know about removing hazardous waste naturally. You can have bioremediation, where microorganisms will break it down into something less harmful. Another thing is phytoremediation, where you use plants to filter and remove those contaminants. Around Chernobyl, they planted sunflowers. Sunflowers are very effective at pulling up the radioactive materials out from the soil, and they store it in the tissues. And then what you do is you come along and you harvest the sunflower plants, and you take the sunflower plants off to a hazardous waste facility for disposal. But those sunflowers are very good at removing radioactive waste. Poplars are good at removing toxic metals and other things that go in the soil, like trees, poplar trees. And last thing, life cycle analysis. As people are deciding about manufacturing materials, they'll look at the life cycle everything from extracting the raw materials all the way through the process of building it and then how you're going to handle it. That's a life cycle analysis. How you're going to handle it after you're done with it, you need to dispose of it. There's integrated waste management that looks at a couple of things where you're trying to reduce waste on the front end as far as using less materials, how you're going to manage the waste, how you're going to dispose of the waste. It's called integrated waste management because you are approaching that waste, the idea that you're going to have waste from several different avenues. And as far as storing hazardous waste, we can have long-term retrievable storage where the waste is stored in drums that you can check on to make sure that there's not problems with it, like escaping out into the environment. And then there are things called secure landfills where hazardous waste is buried and monitored. There are only 21 commercial hazardous waste landfills in the United States. And that's it. I hope that's helpful. See you later.